for them to just say no. HAARP will not be used for weapons applications of weather modification. But instead what they said is, no, it won't affect weather in any significant amount, and therefore it's exempt from this international treaty. When you look at weather modification technologies and development of those technologies, it actually goes back even as far back as the 1950s. In the early 1970s, it was the focus of a great deal of research at China Lakes in California. A number of programs were instituted to develop systems for weather modification. In fact, more recently, in a program called Spacecast 2020, which is a sort of a view of where future weapon systems will go. It was put together by the military. Spacecast 2020 involved 350 scientists. It ended up in a 1,600-page report, of which only about 20 pages were released to the public. But within the context of those pages are discussions of the new weapon systems, including weather modification as a weapon of war, but very cautiously stated, in fact, because they realize that these international agreements prevent that particular use. One of the other applications, and an application that comes extremely important to discuss for the purpose of this presentation, deals with the physiological effects of this science. The effect of this science on human beings is really the most important aspect of the technology. And we need to go back a little bit in history to talk about what sort of things have been discovered or uncovered regarding this kind of science, the use of radio frequency energy and its effects on human beings. We can go back first to a document that we uncovered in our research, a book called Unless Peace Comes, with a chapter in it by a gentleman by the name of Gordon J.F. MacDonald. Mr. MacDonald was actually a professor. He was a professor of geophysics at UCLA, and he was also a science advisor to Lyndon Johnson when Lyndon Johnson was president. What his specialty was, MacDonald's specialty was, the idea of geophysical warfare, the idea of creating triggering events using man-made means for creating huge effects in our immediate environment. The chapter that he wrote for this book was actually called How to Wreck Your Environment. And what he was focusing in on, the things he was zeroing in on in his research, were what would be called nonlinear effects. Effects that don't really make sense on their surface when you think about a small amount of energy going into a system and a large amount of energy coming back. In fact, a scientist, Al Zelinsky, a German scientist, gave us sort of a couple of models to use for describing nonlinear events. And so I'll use those to sort of describe what that entails and sort of explain how this all connects together. If you look back, and Al Zelinsky says, think about it in these terms. He goes, put a row of dominoes lined up from where we are sitting in Seattle, USA, all the way to Paris, and hit the first domino with a 10-gram weight. And then think about all of the energy released as those dominoes fall all the way to Paris. Now picture it a little differently, and think about each one of those dominoes increasing in size by, say, 0.5%. So by the time that the last domino is at Paris, it's about the size of the Eiffel Tower and it's crushing it. And still you initiate the first fall with the 10-gram weight. What exactly is going on there? It's nonlinear. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't line up point to point to point in terms of how we think about energy being released. How could a 10-gram weight cause that kind of an action? Well, it's not the 10-gram weight. It's the interaction between the dominoes and gravity, and the triggering event is the 10-gram weight. The energy release is gravity. The same can be visualized with HAARP-type radio frequency transmitters. In fact, John Heckscher, the program manager for HAARP, indicates that this type of nonlinear effect is possible. In fact, in the documents themselves, they lay out nonlinear effects. One of those nonlinear effects, of an effect discovered by a Professor Innen out of Stanford University, was discovered in Antarctica. The nonlinear effect that he saw was much, much different than the previous example we just gave. What he saw and what he observed in Antarctica was that VLF, very low frequency radio waves, when they strike a coupling point between the ionosphere and magnetosphere, which is an area about 620 miles above the Earth's surface, what occurs, the energy goes up, it strikes this point, and there's a huge energy release where the amount of energy delivered amplifies up to 1,000 times, creating a virtual particle rain over the area below, an energy particle rain. This was discovered using VLF transmitters of very small size. Now remember, back in the very beginning of our presentation today, we talked about 1 billion watts of energy being focused into a narrow beam, striking the ionosphere. Now picture that energy coming up the ionosphere, striking the ionosphere, and amplifying 1,000 times. Now we're talking about a nonlinear effect, bleeding energy off of the magnetosphere in a way that then creates a huge effect, potentially even globally. This is a nonlinear effect. Perhaps it makes a small transmitter like HAARP, large by any other standards, but small compared to Eastland's idea of a transmitter. Perhaps it gives the ability to deliver the kind of energy Eastland envisioned by tapping into that natural energy above our ionospheric shield. Why this is important, again, is it's another area that was missed in all of the disclosures on this project in the course of the development of the technology, and yet the scientist who's named as one of the discoverers of this phenomenon is actually attached to the project. So it's not a miss by accident, it's a miss by design from our perspective. But talking again about physiological effects, we've talked a little bit earlier about this earth-penetrating tomography application, the idea of looking into the earth. Well, when we interviewed John Heckscher, my co-author Gene Manning asked him a question about, well, what frequency ranges, what exactly is going on with this earth-penetrating tomography? And what John Heckscher described was a frequency range running from 1 to 20 hertz, or pulses per second, cycles per second. This just so happens to correlate with predominant brain waves in human beings. The 1 to 20 hertz range, predominant human brain waves run about 1 to 35 hertz for the major brain activity. What has been discovered in science is that externally driving brainwave frequencies is possible. In fact, this research goes back, and we cite it within our book, to a gentleman, Jose Delgado, who was studied electrophysiology at the University of Madrid in Spain. He got his degree in electrophysiology in the early 50s and then came to the United States in the 1960s to work at Yale University as a specialist in brain research. Well, at Yale, what his main area of interest was looking at sort of the effects of electromagnetic fields, electromagnetic energy on brain function. And what he used initially in the 60s were brain implants, electrodes implanted into the brain of primates and in the brains of humans, triggered by electrical impulses, creating various changes in behavior. In fact, the behavioral changes were like turning on the emotions of animals, like switching a light switch on and off. Pretty profound. But what it required were implants. What later happened, and what he later showed, is that this could be done wirelessly. In fact, the way he dramatized this was he put electrodes still implanted, but using radio frequency energy. He had a charging bull in a bull ring coming at him. Within a few feet of reaching him, he threw the switch, and the bull stopped in its tracks. It was an interesting dramatization, but again, it still required implants. What Jose Delgado discovered in the 1980s was that he could create the same effect wirelessly without any implants, using pulsed radio frequency energy. This is unique, this is quite different, and this is exactly what HAARP produces, pulsed radio frequency energy in some of its applications. The application being tested in 1996, earth-penetrating tomography, is just such an application that will utilize this pulsed radio frequency energy.